Imagine tuning in to a late-night sci-fi marathon and realizing the version you saw decades ago was never the full story. The 1960s pushed television boundaries, but censorship fought back harder. Scenes vanished, dialogue was redubbed, and endings were rewritten. Books buried, forgotten cuts that reveal what studios feared most. Welcome to the hidden history of 60s science fiction. Number 12. The Day the Earth Caught Fire, 1961. When this British classic first aired on television, audiences saw a bleak doomsday tale stripped of its rawest edges. The film originally opened with a haunting newsroom sequence drenched in sweat and heat, showing London on the brink of collapse after simultaneous nuclear tests shifted the planet's axis. But on TV, that heatwave chaos was softened. Gone were the sweltering close-ups, the panic in the air, the lingering shots of societal decay. In its uncut form, director Val Guest painted a prophetic vision of human arrogance colliding with nature's fury. The restored scenes added back political debates about nuclear policy and man's moral blindness that networks deemed too anti-establishment. Broadcasters in the United States feared accusations of communist sympathy during the height of the Cold War. Behind the scenes, Val Guest fought censors who wanted to insert optimism. The BBC redubbed the film's ending to sound less hopeless. The final line, originally a chilling uncertainty about whether the Earth survived, was muted into ambiguity. For decades, only European prints carried the original apocalyptic tone. When the uncut version resurfaced in archives in the 1990s, audiences were stunned at how much had been altered. It was not just a disaster movie, it was a political warning buried by fear. In every cut frame lay the story of a generation terrified by its own inventions. Number 11. Village of the Damned, 1960. The eerie brilliance of Village of the Damned terrified audiences with its quiet menace, but the version that appeared on television screens years later was a sanitized ghost of the original nightmare. Based on John Wyndham's The Midwich Cuckoos, the story of children born with alien intelligence and chilling control over adults pushed moral panic to its edge. Censors were especially disturbed by a sequence showing the psychic children manipulating townsfolk into acts of violence. On TV, entire deaths were excised, leaving gaps of logic. In one famous scene, a man drives a car into a wall under mental compulsion, cut down to seconds in the broadcast version, robbing it of its dread. Networks feared the implications obedient citizens controlled by unseen forces mirrored the growing anxiety about totalitarian regimes and propaganda. The studio quietly complied, trading tension for family-friendly programming hours. Even the chilling score was softened to make it less disturbing. Behind the scenes, MGM's British division lamented the edits, but American affiliates refused to air it uncut. The unedited reels vanished into storage for decades. When the full cut resurfaced for DVD restoration in the late 1990s, viewers finally saw the original intensity, the blank eyes of children unblinking as society unraveled. It was not just horror. It was a mirror of obedience in an age when free thought was feared. Each missing second told a story of what mid-century America did not want to see its own reflection. Number 9. Planet of the Vampires, 1965. When audiences first saw Planet of the Vampires, it was dismissed as just another gothic space thriller. But the uncut version revealed something far stranger and far more influential. Directed by the visionary Mario Bava, the film followed two starships responding to a distress call on a desolate planet. What they found was not rescue but reanimation as their dead crewmates returned possessed by alien forces. For television syndication, much of Bava's visual language was stripped away. The eerie fog sequences were trimmed, and entire moments of body horror were removed. The networks felt the film's atmosphere was too disturbing for American households. But it was those very scenes that inspired the claustrophobic terror later seen in Alien. In the uncut version, Bava's use of color and stillness built an unbearable tension. Red mist rolled over blackened landscapes, while motionless figures stared through space helmets like ghosts trapped between life and death. Italian and Spanish prints carried that poetry of dread, but U.S. stations turned it into a brisk monster movie. Censors objected to the idea of possession and death merged as one. They even changed the title card to reduce associations with the undead. The missing frames buried its philosophical weight that humanity's greatest fear was not aliens, but becoming alien to itself. When restored decades later, the uncut version stunned modern audiences. What once seemed like pulp fiction became art. It was not just a movie about vampires in space. It was a parable about identity lost in the void of progress. Planet of the Vampires proved that censorship doesn't just remove scenes, it erases meaning. Number 8. Fahrenheit 451, 1966. When Francois Truffaut adapted Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, he delivered one of the most haunting visions of authoritarian control ever filmed. But television could not handle its quiet rage. The uncut theatrical version was suffused with despair and beauty, showing firemen burning not only books, but the very idea of thought. When it hit American TV, the network slashed key sequences that revealed emotional truth. The opening montage of state propaganda was shortened. The moment Montag's wife overdoses on sleeping pills was cut to mere seconds. Even the closing scene of exiles memorizing books beside the frozen river was softened with redubbed narration suggesting hope where none existed. Executives worried the film's message would seem anti-government during a time of political unrest. The year was 1968 when protests and censorship collided in real life. So, they made it safe. The result was an echo rather than a warning. Behind the scenes, Truffaut was heartbroken. He felt his film had been gutted. The rhythm of silence he had built, the tension between fire and memory, was lost to time slots and moral codes. The uncut version was eventually restored for art houses, where viewers discovered its quiet rebellion. In its full length, Fahrenheit 451 is not only about burning books, but about burning identity. It asks what happens when imagination itself becomes a threat. In the end, the missing scenes told the same truth as Bradbury's words. When you censor ideas, you also censor the soul. Number 7. Quatermass and the Pit, 1967. Quatermass and the Pit was a revelation of British science fiction. When it hit theaters, it shocked audiences with its fusion of alien horror and ancient mythology. But when it crossed over to television years later, the power of its message was diluted by heavy cuts. The story followed archaeologists uncovering a buried spacecraft beneath London. What they unearthed was proof of humanity's genetic manipulation by an ancient Martian race. The uncut version confronted evolution and religion head-on, implying that our violent instincts were inherited from alien ancestors. That notion frightened both censors and clergy. For broadcast, the controversial dialogues about faith and creation were removed. Scenes of psychic hysteria tearing through London streets were trimmed for sensitivity. Even the image of the towering Martian apparition at the finale was reduced to flashes of light. BBC affiliates worried the film's intensity and moral questions would offend conservative audiences. American stations treated it like a simple monster flick, trimming the psychological core. Director Roy Ward Baker protested but lost the battle. The uncut print survived only in overseas archives until its restoration decades later. When shown again in full, it was hailed as visionary, blending horror and science with intellect. Today, viewers see what television once hid, a story about the ghosts of evolution and the violence coded in our DNA. It was never about aliens invading Earth. It was about the truth already living inside us. Quatermass and the Pit reminds us that censorship is not just about fear of violence, it is fear of knowledge itself. Number 6. The Time Travelers, 1964. The Time Travelers began as a modest B-movie, but its uncut version revealed ideas decades ahead of its time. The story followed a group of scientists who accidentally open a portal to the far future, where humanity hides underground after the Earth's surface becomes a wasteland. In the theatrical cut, it was bleak, visionary, and philosophical. But when it aired on television, the network stripped away its unease. Scenes showing the decaying world above ground were deleted to avoid frightening viewers. The ending, where the travelers become trapped in an endless time loop, was shortened and softened. What had been a disturbing paradox became a happy accident. Behind the scenes, producer Robert Clark fought to keep the darker cut intact, but censors claimed the material was too grim for Sunday night audiences. They even trimmed the sequences showing the androids dismantling humans for experimentation, arguing it blurred moral boundaries. The uncut version presented a haunting idea that technology could evolve without emotion, leaving humanity behind. Television executives saw that message as too cynical for the family hour. When fans rediscovered the original negative decades later, they found something striking. The film's loops, its mirrored scenes, its eerie silences formed a meditation on human futility. The uncut version turned pulp into prophecy. The television edit was safe. The original was unsettling. And that is why it still matters today, because sometimes the truth about the future cannot be packaged for comfort. Number 5. The Andromeda Strain, 1969. Michael Crichton's The Andromeda Strain was one of the most scientifically accurate thrillers of its era. Yet its first TV airing removed the very scenes that gave it realism. The film chronicled a secret team of scientists racing to contain a deadly extraterrestrial microbe that wiped out an entire town. In theaters, audiences saw sterile labs, claustrophobic corridors, and slow-mounting dread. The uncut version showed the panic of containment, the moral debates about experimentation, and the moral weight of sacrifice. But television executives thought it was too cold and too intellectual. They trimmed the autopsy scenes that established the horror of the virus and cut dialogue criticizing military secrecy. The studio feared comparisons to government cover-ups of real biological experiments. They even re-edited the ending to make the resolution more heroic, less ambiguous. Behind the scenes, director Robert Wise protested. He argued that his film was meant to provoke thought, not provide comfort. But sponsors demanded optimism and order. The resulting TV version felt hollow, stripped of consequence. When Criterion restored the uncut print decades later, critics recognized how bold the original had been. It wasn't just about a pathogen. It was about human arrogance, the belief that science could control everything. In its full form, the Andromeda Strain becomes a mirror for our time. Every cut, every line removed was a symptom of fear, not infection. Number 4. The Power, 1968. George Pal's The Power was a cerebral thriller about human evolution and psychic supremacy. In its uncut form, it was deeply unsettling, showing how knowledge can corrupt the mind. The film followed a group of scientists who discover one of them possesses superhuman mental powers capable of killing with thought. For television, broadcast networks stripped it of its psychological weight. Scenes showing hallucinations and mental torment were shortened. The dreamlike sequences of the protagonist being hunted through warped cityscapes were re-edited into simple chase scenes. The original hinted at the dangers of unchecked intellect and the thin line between genius and godhood. But television standards of the late 60s demanded clarity and simplicity. They feared that surreal imagery would confuse viewers and disturb sponsors. Pal was disappointed. He saw his film as a warning that evolution might not lead to enlightenment, but domination. When networks cut those moments of ambiguity, the story lost its meaning. The uncut version resurfaced years later, revealing brilliant practical effects and a tone closer to Twilight Zone horror than mainstream sci-fi. Fans hailed it as one of Pal's most daring works, a film that predicted modern debates about power and morality. In its censored form, The Power was just a thriller. In its true form, it was a prophecy. It dared to ask whether humanity deserves the abilities it craves, and that question was one the networks never wanted the audience to hear. Number 3. Seconds, 1966. John Frankenheimer's Seconds was one of the most haunting science fiction dramas of its decade and one of the most brutally censored. The story followed an aging banker who undergoes a secret surgical transformation to become a younger man living a new life under a false identity. It was a story about regret control and the illusion of freedom. The uncut theatrical version was disturbing and raw-filled with surreal imagery that mirrored the loss of identity. When it reached television, most of that intensity vanished. The hallucinatory surgery sequence, once a disorienting ballet of scalpels and panic, was heavily trimmed. Scenes that questioned the morality of corporate control were reduced to avoid controversy. Network censors believed the film's themes were too adult, too existential for prime time. They demanded a softer tone and redubbed lines suggesting redemption rather than despair. The chilling final scene where the protagonist realizes he has been condemned to death for wanting change was nearly removed entirely. Behind the scenes, Frankenheimer was devastated. He believed the story was not about horror, but about humanity's hunger for meaning in a manufactured world. Critics later called Seconds one of the most visionary films of its era, a precursor to dystopian works like The Matrix. When the uncut version was restored for home release, it was finally understood as a tragic masterpiece. Seconds was never just science fiction. It was a warning that in a world obsessed with perfection, the price of renewal might be your soul. Television feared that message because it was too close to the truth. Number 2, 2001, A Space Odyssey, 1968. Stanley Kubrick's 2001. A Space Odyssey changed cinema forever, but the version that aired on television was not the one Kubrick made. The uncut theatrical experience was hypnotic, slow, and transcendent. The broadcast version turned it into a spectacle stripped of its silence and mystery. Networks feared viewers would lose patience with the film's pacing, so they cut entire sequences of visual meditation. The opening Dawn of Man segment was shortened, removing moments that bridged evolution with consciousness. The famous Stargate sequence was truncated into a mere blur of color instead of a cosmic journey. Even Hal's eerie conversations were condensed to remove pauses that Kubrick had used to build tension. The edits weren't just technical, they were philosophical. Kubrick's vision was about humanity confronting infinity, but television wanted it to fit inside a commercial break. Executives even re-edited the music cues, adding narration to explain scenes that were meant to remain wordless. Behind the scenes, Kubrick reportedly refused to watch the TV cut. He called it an act of vandalism. For him, 2001 was a spiritual experience, not entertainment. When audiences later saw the uncut version in restored format, they realized how much had been lost. It wasn't about astronauts or computers. It was about man and his maker, his machine, and his destiny. The cuts turned awe into confusion. The uncut version turned silence into revelation. 2001 reminded the world that some stories cannot be trimmed without killing their meaning. Number 1, Barbarella, 1968. At first glance, Barbarella looked like a campy space adventure starring Jane Fonda as a fearless explorer of interstellar desire and danger. But the uncut version of the film was a reflection of rebellion and freedom that terrified television censors. When it aired years later, the broadcast version was almost unrecognizable. Gone were the surreal dream sequences, the abstract art direction, and the moments of psychological liberation that defined its spirit. The networks removed scenes that challenged moral codes, replacing them with jump cuts that made the story incoherent. The original film wasn't about titillation, it was about liberation and individuality in a mechanized universe. The uncut version explored the tension between innocence and control, between purity and corruption. But television could not handle that complexity. They wanted a space comedy, not a philosophical allegory. Director Roger Vadim had intended Barbarella to be both satire and prophecy, showing how utopia without empathy becomes tyranny. In its censored form, all that remained were costumes and colors. The soul was gone. When restored decades later, film historians recognized its brilliance. Beneath the gloss was a profound commentary on freedom, conformity, and the human need to feel alive in a world ruled by order. Barbarella's lost footage proved that even the wildest fantasy could speak truth to power, and when truth made people uncomfortable, it was easier to cut it than to confront it. The uncut version turned ridicule into revelation, and that was exactly what television feared most. Across the 1960s, science fiction dared to question everything: power, faith, identity, and progress. Yet, television trimmed away the very questions that made those stories matter. Each missing scene was a warning silenced by fear. So, what other truths still lie unseen in forgotten reels? Stay curious, explore the uncut past, and subscribe for more untold cinema history.